and good evening to those of you in Europe, and good morning to those of you in Australia. Welcome to the closing plenary session of the ESIG 2021 Spring Technical Workshop. All good things must come to an end, but we're going to wrap up with a really great session on some timely industry events. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG, and I will provide a few brief opening remarks. As you know, our spring workshops are being held online and are open to everyone. The workshop was planned with the input of our ESIG Offerings Committee, chaired by Bethany Frew of NREL and Julia Matoivasan of ERCOT. The committee consists of the chairs of our 6 working groups and several of our board members. We have a great set of volunteers who really make ESIG what it is, and we encourage you to become involved if you're not already. Regarding logistics, I would ask you to note that the webinar will be 2 hours long. We had a lot of feedback that our 1-hour workshop sessions were too rushed, so we're experimenting with some longer formats for the spring workshop. Our revised format today will have a number of individual presentations of 10 to 20 minutes each in the first half of the session, followed by 45 minutes to an hour of discussion and Q&A after the last speaker. As we are doing with all of our webinars now, we'll be using the Slido platform for managing the Q&A, not the WebEx platform. You should go to slido.com on your device and enter ESIG8 as the event code to ask your questions. Please be sure to indicate the person to whom you're addressing the question. The instructions are also in the background slide for the webinar, and you'll be reminded by the session chair. You will see a thumbs up button next to the question on Slido to allow you to vote on prioritizing the questions submitted. So please keep the questions coming. Sorry about that. Yeah, keep the questions coming during the presentations, and we'll address them at the end. We'll follow up with written answers to any questions we don't get to during the Q&A. Recognizing the limitations of a webinar with more than 100 people on the lines will be muted. So again, we ask you to use the Slido platform to ask your questions with ESIG8 as the event code. Today's session is titled Resource Adequacy, Rolling Blackouts, and Wildfires. This session was planned a few months ago after the recent events of a related nature in Australia and California. There's growing recognition that we cannot find all of our emerging weather patterns in the historical record, and we'll need to plan for a future that's possibly quite different from the past. The common mode failures introduced with a correlation between weather, load, and generation will also call for new planning methods in the future. The session will be chaired by Mark O'Malley of UC Dublin, currently serving as Chief Scientist for Energy Systems Integration at ESIG. Mark is a well-known figure in the energy systems integration space, chair of our Research and Education Working Group, and a leader in the Global Power System Transformation Initiative. Mark is a good friend and a regular contributor to ESIG activities and is well known to many of you. We're very happy to have him here with us today. Mark, we appreciate your participation, and I'll now turn it over to you.
So, hello, can you hear me, Ryan?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry, okay, that's fine. Okay, thanks, Charlie. So I've always wondered, Charlie's always locked himself into calling everybody who chairs a session a good friend. Someday he's going to change that statement and say he's going to introduce someone who's not a good friend. So he's locked into, if he doesn't say he's a good friend of everybody, he'll feel left out. So Charlie may want to change your pattern. Okay, so I'm going to chair this session. It's for 2 hours. I'm going to make a few opening remarks, a couple of slides, and then I'm going to get straight into it. So first of all, just on the content side, so 38 days of, and then, you know, what's 38 days? It's 38 days since the ESIG, this whole session started in March. Okay, so it's been 38 days every Tuesday and Thursday. And I was looking back on it. I attended a lot of the sessions myself, and you know, a lot of things came up there, a lot of stuff about IBRs, hybrid systems, transmission, etc., etc. And it all seems like a bit of a wildfire, if you know what I mean. And things are coming at us so fast. So in this particular session, in resource adequacy, we're going to try and deal with a lot of these issues because a lot of them impact on resource adequacy. Just to say one thing at the outset as well, we planned this event several months ago before the ERCOT issue happened, and this is not about the ERCOT event in any way. And if it does come up and we start to drift into it too much because it's topical, I'll pull us back. I would suspect that we'll have a special event, or the next ESIG meeting will probably cover ERCOT in quite some detail. One of our speakers will say a few words about it. Just some housekeeping. Note Charlie's instructions. There's going to be an audience participation session in this through WebEx, something new. We don't often try it, but we're going to try something on the audience participation side. And the last thing is the Q&A will be at the end. And again, to emphasize what Charlie just said, slide out ESIG 8. Next slide, please, Ryan. So the panel, the panel and you. So the panel is Phil, ISO, or CAISO, Ben from AEMO. And then we're going to have a bit of audience participation. The audience that's you, the audience there. It's going to be followed by David Bones. So the first two speakers are going to be about 15, 20 minutes max. And the last three speakers are going to be much shorter. David Bones from Australia as well, Erik from EPRI, and Arne Olsen. And like I said, the audience participation is going to be just a little bit in between those. Just some background on this. How we got here, where we are. I started in this area, capacity value of wind back in the late 2000s, 2006, 7, 8, 9. And here's I was the chair of the IEEE task force on this issue. And here's a paper we published in 2011. But it's interesting that although this paper came out in 2011 and many more did before and after it, I still found on the Union of Concerned Scientists, this gentleman here wrote an article on October 12, 2020, saying ELCC explained the critical renewable energy concept you've never heard of. So I think the message I want to give there is, despite all the work we've done in this area, we may not be communicating it well enough to people. So that's just a general point I'd like to make. Next slide. Yesterday on Tuesday, there was a very good session that I attended, and Alex, sorry, I can't pronounce his name that well, Rudkovic, he was doing a very nice talk on electricity gas interactions. And in one of the slides, I asked him, could I use his slide? He said, sure. You can see that even for what he's doing, resource adequacy electric models that capture transmission details. So even though we've been working this in a long time, we don't really know how to do resource adequacy with transmission. We don't know how to quantify it. We don't know how to quantify the impact of transmission. So there's a lot still to be done. And that does not include the other things that are happening, that's happening at the moment. Next slide. There's a lot more going on, and it's all happening together. I think that's the interesting thing about this whole area. It's not just one thing is changing, but nearly everything is changing, and they're all changing simultaneously. So, you've got the issue of transmission I just mentioned. We still haven't cracked that one. Wind and solar PV, increase in penetration. We lack of data, operational experience with them. It's about net load, not about peak load. Storage and demand side. I mean, depending on how you operate them, you'll get a different value for resource adequacy. Flexible demand is changing the meaning about the ability to meet the demand. Electrification of heat and transport, that's increasing the dimensionality of the problem space. So it's not just electricity, you're interacting with the transport system, the heat system, and there's all the issues about resource adequacy and how they play on that. The underlying statistics are all changing. I think it's a very important part of this. If the underlying resources change, the underlying statistics change, and the metrics we use to capture, we represent LOLE or whatever it is, it's probably done fine for up to now, but maybe we should look at different metrics. And then there's the whole issue of resilience, which is another topic that's a lot of people speak about. And is there a metric for resilience, for example? Should we be designing systems with respect to resilience metrics? So these are all questions that are out there. The second last bullet, I think, states the obvious, but all models are approximations. As things change, we need to revisit them from time to time. But there's so much changing here. I've just been fooling around here, but daily, things are changing so fast in the system that the revisitation to the models is happening more and more often. And then what about the politicians and climate change itself? I mean, the reason I put the politicians in there is because, when things happen, the politicians generally get involved if there's a blackout, etc. And climate change itself is a huge driver. So I've shown it all on the right-hand side here. You've got all these things sort of pouring down into a hopper, and out pops resource adequacy. So with all those things changing, our speakers this evening, or this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are going to cover all of these topics in one way or the other. I've seen the slides already, so you're in for a bit of a whirlwind here of all these different elements and how they impact on resource adequacy. Okay, I think that's my last slide. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Two important initiatives from ESIG's point of view and the Global Power System Transformation Consortium. The GPST put out a research agenda recently. You can see it on the left there. And within it, a lot of the research questions we've identified do relate to resource adequacy. And ESIG itself has a task force in this area, redefining resource adequacy for modern power systems. That's run by Derek Stentlick. And you can see that some of the research questions from the research agenda are being tackled by that task force. So they're just two things to be aware of that ESIG is at in this general space. That is definitely my last slide. So our first speaker this evening is Phil Pettingill from CAISO. I've known Phil for, Phil is one of these people who I've only met during the pandemic, so I've never met Phil in person. I've met him many times on the phone and on various calls, etc. So Phil is from CAISO, and he's also a stalwart of the GPST. So Phil, it's over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. And again, welcome everybody to the session here this afternoon and this morning. And like Mark was saying, wherever you are in the world. But looking forward to this conversation with all of you and certainly the rest of my my fellow panelists. In terms of getting started here this afternoon or during the session, what I thought I'd do is I'd start with a definition of resource adequacy. As I say here on this slide, there's certainly many different definitions, but in terms of a working definition for us today, concept of RA is having enough resources. Mark touched on the issue of delivery, so transmission certainly is an aspect to that, but also making sure that we're assessing a wide range of conditions. Of course, what we also see, though, is the timeframes that RA programs are run sometimes are as narrow as a monthly program, but also annually or even more than annually. But the important thing is resource adequacy is a forward process. And really, that's what I wanted to highlight here in the last bullet is resource adequacy is a fundamental characteristic of our reliability, the way we look at it from a CAISO perspective. But more importantly, it's a structured framework to ensure that there is enough procurement and there's adequacy there. Of course, one of the key things that we're constantly struggling with is that it's only as good as those input assumptions. And certainly with climate change and some of the other things, Mark, that you've mentioned and we'll talk about later in the rest of the panel, the challenge then is how to manage those. And ultimately, any effective RA program has to make assumptions about the level of risk and how much mitigation that you are willing to accept. So what we found is when we start looking at different levels of RA, there are drivers, and more importantly, what's happening in the Western interconnection is a pretty broad conversation about RA, because it's no longer just California, but the Pacific Northwest and other portions of the system are also getting more and more concerned whether there is sufficient adequacy in the West. And that's really being driven by the change to lower GHG emitting resources. Not to say that those are problematic, but rather it needs to be an effective transition. And so not only are we losing flexibility in the resources that we have to operate the system, so we're looking for that from the new resources, but we're also finding that the load and the demand on the system is being much more variable. And as a result, we actually start to look to the load to potentially help us manage some of that variability. So the real risk here is ensuring that we've got enough resources available to us as we go through the transition. And what I like to point out is there's a significant concern about the lumpiness of generation capacity, because shutting down one large power plant may not be a problem in the aggregate, but unless we're certain that we've replaced that power plant sufficiently with dispatchable resources that can give us the energy when we need it and have the flexibility to operate the grid, we run into other additional risks that are likely to cause problems in operating it. So to finish with sort of just our working definition of RA, it's that forward study trying to determine what the requirements are. It's a showing that the jurisdictional entities, whomever are part of the program, have actually procured sufficient enough. It's important to make sure that those resources are actually there. And so to the extent that there's any shortage, there needs to be appropriate incentives to fill those short positions And ultimately, all of that capacity needs to be available to the system operator, whether it's a market operator like an ISO or just a single balancing area operator in a much larger system. So moving on, what I wanted to do is take us back to basically a year ago, where I actually talked about here at ESIG what one of the biggest concerns we were seeing within California was a potential capacity shortfall in 2020. And without necessarily going through that full presentation again, I just wanted to highlight really what we talked about at that point. And what we were projecting back then is that the peak demand we were envisioning was likely going to have a deficiency. And the reason for that is because the shutdown of about as much as 4,000 megawatts of once-through cooling resources, a reduction in imports, because what we're seeing is many of our neighbors are actually going through the same type of transition that California is, and we're seeing that now more broadly across the US and certainly even many places across the world. But then also recognizing that with climate change, in many cases, the hydro conditions are potentially limiting the available of energy. And so the result here is that when we rely more and more on solar and wind resources, we've got to make sure we're planning that those resources can still operate when they're needed. And we were projecting a shortfall in 2020. I highlighted at that point exactly the condition that we struggled with in August of last year. And I'll touch on the August scenario at that time. But what we talked about last year was this curve showing that the blue diagram is the gross peak load occurring at about 5 p.m. But the green graph is the net peak load. And this is the one that we're actually finding ourselves having to operate the system to, because this takes and subtracts the wind and solar from the fleet available to us. And ultimately what we find is about 8 p.m. is when that net peak load is occurring. And what's important to understand is by 8 p.m., we no longer have any solar available to us to operate the grid. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. But more importantly, what we saw then last year was these graphics that showed that during the 4 to 9 p.m. Period, we were depending upon imports coming in from the rest of the Western interconnection. And that's this gray band that you see on the top of these two stacks. And ultimately, what we projected was a slight shortage in 2020. Ironically, while we project 2,300 megawatts, we ended up having to shed 1,000 megawatts of load, and we'll talk about that in a second. But 2020 does get worse. One of the things that the state's done is try to reduce that by not retiring the once-through cooling resources that are projected, and that should help us get through. But of course, it still depends on what happens with the weather. So let me shift gears here because, as Mark said in opening our discussion for today, we wanted to talk about different reasons that there are outages. And one of the things that's been relatively unique to California, but other areas in the Western interconnection have started to develop this as well, and that's the Public Safety Power Shutoff Program, the PSPS. And what I wanted to do is clarify for all of you that while PSPS can interrupt load, it's not a resource adequacy issue. What it is it in fact is really a concern about safety and to consumers. And so ultimately, this is those that are the transmission operators in California, or the investor-owned utilities, have had to work out with the California Public Utilities Commission on under what conditions would they, in fact, interrupt service to their customers by taking transmission lines out of service. Now, that's what they're doing on their side of the equation. And these are, of course, completely independent of what the ISO does in operating and balancing the bulk electric system for about 80% of California, as well as with our energy imbalance market, about 80% of the load throughout the west of the interconnection. And so then what we're focused on is actually facilitating what those outages are. And what we'll do that and how we go about doing that is actually analyzing and communicating back to those investor-owned utilities what are the impacts of taking certain transmission lines out of the service at the point in which they intend to do that. So we start that process as much as 48 to 72 hours in advance. And what we're doing is looking at the impacts of load to that particular investor-owned utility that's interrupting their facilities. And so what I thought I'd do is give you a sense of what I mean by that by showing you two different scenarios here. And so in the case of the first scenario, what we see here is if it's a lower voltage facility, like a 60 kV facility, that may be completely isolated and only be affecting PG&E load, let's say in this case here in the northwestern portion of California. And so it's really just a loss of load for us, the system operator. But on the other hand, if we look at something much larger, where it's a loss of actual transmission or bulk transmission to the grid, in this case, what projected here is the loss of the California-Oregon intertie, where we typically are importing anywhere from 2 to 3 or almost 4,000 megawatts of energy, then ultimately what would have to happen is start to shed very large loads, quantities of load. And in some cases, that can actually start to affect other balancing areas within the interconnection. And in this case here, we're looking at a bank and their balancing area where they would potentially lose as much as 900 megawatts of imports they may be depending upon. And as a result, they'll have to now rebalance their system under this kind of scenario. And so you see here then that large drops of, or large transmission lines can cause a substantial impact on the operation of the grid. And that's what we're doing as a system operator, trying to look for those and make sure that we're prepared for it whenever a PSPS event occurs. So the last couple slides, I wanted to spend a few minutes with you and just walk you through what was it that, from a system operator perspective, was occurring in August 14 and 15 of last year for in California operations. Now, those of you that pay attention to what we're operating when we get in these stress conditions may be aware of our alerts, warnings, and emergency notification system. And what we basically are doing is, first of all, using a flex alert, which is then a public appeal to everyone to recognize that we're going to be in stress conditions and ask for commercial and residential customers to conserve their consumption and try to help us by just reducing the amount of demand on the system. We'll also send out notices to all of the infrastructure owners, whether it be transmission or generation owners, ask them to restrict or basically take their hands off all of the maintenance operations that they would be doing under those kind of conditions. And what you see here is these things now start to escalate because the next step is to go towards an alert. What we're doing is communicating to all of our market participants. We want them to try to increase their bids, provide as much as they can into the day ahead market. But ultimately, within the operational day where these kinds of conditions can occur, we're going to put out a warning. And at that point, we're able to now trigger demand response and demand response programs that may or may not be participating in the ISO markets, but we can certainly access those because we're now almost entering a stage 1 event. And for us, stage 1 means we're no longer able to maintain our contingency reserves. And as a system operator, we're required by NERC standards to maintain a 6% contingency reserve to protect against the loss of a major transmission line or generating facility that, of course, could cause much larger impacts to the operation of the grid. At stage 2, we're going to start actually engaging in the market ourselves and potentially putting generators online and taking manual control of things wherever there may be additional resources available to us. But finally, when we get to a stage 3, and that's what happened in August of last year, we may have to interrupt involuntary load interruptions because we've actually gone through and used all of those resources that were available to us, including the demand response programs leading up to that event. So with that set of definitions, you can see here on this timeline that what we did marching into August 14 was literally 2 days in advance on the 12th, issuing that restricted maintenance operation notice. On the next day, issuing that alert and looking for as much as we could get, the flex alert, the warnings that I mentioned, and then ultimately finding that, during the operational afternoon now, you can see at 2:56 on the 14th, we actually lost some generation And certainly that does happen. We certainly have forced outages frequently while operating this electric grid. But by 3:20, we had declared that stage 2 emergency, meaning that we're out of well, we're still trying to protect our contingency reserves, but we are anticipating that we have to go into that stage 3. And ultimately, stage 3, we did declare it at 6:30. I'll point out that that 6:30, of course, occurred, after that 5 p.m. gross load peak, but as we were moving into that 7 and 8 p.m. net load peak. And so this gives you a little bit more of a different view by looking at sort of the sequence of events I had on the timeline. And you can see that here by 5:15 now, we had dispatched about 800 megawatts of that demand response in trying to avoid the stage 3, but unable to do that. And ultimately by 6:46, we had to order the 500 megawatts of load shed. So at 6:36, the first 500, and 10 minutes later, an additional 500 for a total 1,000 megawatts. And it wasn't then until about 8 o'clock at 7:56 that we could finally start to ask the load serving entities to restore that 1,000 megawatts of load. So similar event happened on the 15th, where we marched into those afternoon times, and you see what happened in the 4 to 5 p.m. time frame is all of a sudden our wind output actually increased, which was helping us. But literally in the hour later, 5 to 6, it rapidly decreased. And what we mean here by the California ISO ACE is its area control error. And what it means is we were leaning on the rest of the West by over 1,000 megawatts, or 1,421 megawatts we were drawing from the rest of the Western interconnection because we had lost so much of the wind resources in serving our load. And in the end, ultimately at 6:25, you see, we had to shed 470 megawatts of load, to try to balance the system. But it was literally about 20 minutes later, we were able to actually order that load back on. And so this just shows you how close to the operating edge we were when we get to these kinds of timeframes when systems are very, very tight on us and unable to help us operate the grid under those conditions that are critical. So this graphic shows you what actually happened on August 17. And what's a reason why I wanted to share this with you, because August 17 actually had an even higher load forecast of over 49,000 megawatts. And that was at that 5 p.m. time frame. And what you see then moving more towards the 8 p.m., that 8 to 9 period, was yes, the load did decline and declined, more than 2,000 megawatts. But what you see in the numbers below is that of the RA capacity we had available to us, the RA capacity declined 3,000 megawatts. And so the end result is while load goes down, we lose more resources than the load. And that put us in a condition where we anticipated being very, very short. In the end, we did not have to shed load. And the reason for that were really some of these kinds of mitigation efforts that we took. We were working with the other utilities as well as the California state agencies. The governor was very helpful with us because we were projecting what it was anticipated to be even worse conditions. But we also were able to do some things in our market, such as suspending the convergence bidding and also putting all the demand on notice that we would have to start to shed load if we didn't see those kinds of reductions. And in the end, we saw load conservation make such a significant reduction, we were able to compensate for that. So I'm going to stop there. Well, actually, I guess what I'll do is just sort of summarize for all of you and just say that as we hand off to the rest of my fellow panel members here, what I think is most important to think about where we are in resource adequacy and going forward is the bulk electric system here in the West and throughout the world is going through a significant transition as we move to much lower GHG resources. Our challenge is now, how do we deal with that when we're losing the flexibility and the operational capabilities that we used to have going into that period of time? And so it's going to be important to make sure we have sufficient replacements before we start retiring, because it looks like things are now on the edge and we've got to look for those potholes in the road that we're traveling. And so 3 key areas that I'd like to make sure we talk about today is, one is the counting rules. how do you assess the resources to make sure that they're aligning with what the load profile is? Because certainly the demand is changing. What's the level of risk we're willing to take? It's important to know that in California's RA program, they're forecasting the load basically with 50-50 odds. It's a 1 in 2 load forecast. And so should we consider moving something that's more conservative, like a 1 in 10 load forecast? And then finally, I think where we're going to be going on a forward basis because of some of these really high impact events is operations preparing to actually operate through these events and thinking about things like how can we have staged load shedding so we can move into these kind of really challenging conditions and move out of these conditions without necessarily putting the whole system at risk. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Mark. Thank you for the opportunity to open up the panel.
Okay, thank you. Just for everyone's information, I'm having some problem with my camera. I may not be able to turn it back on. Apparently some other application is using it. I don't know what that means, but anyway, maybe the CIA are looking at me. Okay, thanks, Phil. I think if you are paying attention to this, you can see a trend already in what Phil is speaking about. I mean, he concentrated a lot on the operation of the system, and because I think the operations are actually becoming more important in resource adequacy. And he also mentioned a few of the topics that I mentioned. There's going to be more and more of that. Okay, I've also noticed on Slido there's some questions coming in, and keep them coming. I know that you're allowed to be anonymous, but it's always nice to see people's names if you wish to give them. And in addition, I think that the questions that we have for you after this session are very appropriate considering the questions that you have posed in Slido. So our next speaker will be Ben Jones from Australia. So Ben has over 10 years experience in forecasting, asset management, planning, and he's currently responsible for, he's the supply adequacy stream lead for AEMO. So Ben, over to you.
Mark. So it's me mostly talking today about resource adequacy in the context of some of the events that we've had recently, including the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires that occurred in Australia. I'm going to be talking about that. Next slide. There we go. I'm mostly going to be talking today about the national electricity market, which is the market which services the east coast of Australia. It is a very long transmission network, very long power system with generally low population density relative to other parts of the world. At the moment, it still includes quite a lot of coal resources, but like many other parts of the world, it's rapidly transforming to a more variable-based supply platform. We've had two summers recently, the 2019-20 summer and the 2020-21 summer. The 2019-20 summer was by far much more challenging to operate through than 2021. 2021 was a La Nina summer with a lot more rainfall and not so many of the risks that occurred in 2019-20. 1920 was particularly notable for the bushfires amongst a variety of other incidents. But the bushfires were a period of, it was Australia's second hottest summer on record with periods of real extreme heat. Extreme heat really occurring over parts of New South Wales and Australian Capital Territory. And this map here shows a lot of the bushfires are seen from space. The power system was particularly stressed during this period. Lots of power system impacts were noted, including the unexpected temperature derating of a variety of wind farms, reductions in both utility scale and distributed PV output due to smoke particulate, and also some voltage fluctuations. Numerous local distribution and transmission outages. I think most challenging from a system operator was about 55 bushfire-related transmission impacts, resulting in 28 unplanned outages of the 330 kV transmission network. And the separation of New South Wales and Victoria electrical regions, effectively splitting the whole market into a northern island and a southern island. Now, New South Wales and Victoria are probably the two most well-connected regions, so it's not really a frequent or designed outcome for those two regions to separate. As a result, there were some frequency excursions as balancing occurred on those two sides. Lack of reserve conditions were declared, some dispatch of emergency reserve mechanisms, and a later separation of New South Wales from Queensland as well. Exploring that separation a little bit further, this shows the two regions electrically and the types of incidents that were occurring. So you can see that the 330 kV network was effectively split just north of the Victoria-New South Wales border, with many incidents occurring all the way from 11:47 in the morning to much later at night, with a peak at that 2:30 in the afternoon. And some of those lines sustained damage that didn't get restored until much later in January. One of the interesting things about this, though, is while it was really challenging to operate the power system through this, and we managed to call on some emergency reserves, there actually wasn't a large amount of load shedding through this event. Consumers were mostly able to be stayed connected, other than some of those local instances. So it kind of raises the question, were the resources adequate? Was the power system resilient? Even though it was extremely challenging to operate, even though there were some system security excursions during this period, generally the consumer experience was quite good. One of the things that we've done past this is have a look and say, well, actually, if we look more, were we lucky, or is this system actually quite resilient in this case? So what we've done is said the bushfires and separations presented operational challenges, but this really occurred on the 4th of January during a period where commerce and industry was quite low in terms of their demand. So what we've done is we've looked to see if that event was to occur under a different set of circumstances. When demand was higher, the operational challenge would have been even greater, but we would have ended up in a situation where the resources were inadequate and the need for load shedding would have been far more substantial. What these simulations show is that under a less lucky timing, if this had occurred a little bit later in the year, later in January or early February, when consumer demand would have been much higher, we would have found ourselves in a situation where consumers in New South Wales may have experienced load shedding up to 2 or 3 gigawatts, or around about 1 million households. One of the things that we've been working with is Australia's science and meteorological agencies to really look and improve the planning for the physical risks of climate change. We're really trying to answer this question, how resilient should the power system be to climate change, and how do we plan for a future with increasing numbers of disasters like what was observed in February in 1920 summer. And this work has really been focusing on some of the highest vulnerabilities, things like the projected increases in average and extreme temperatures, increases in extreme bushfire weather, changes to high wind events, cyclones, changes in precipitation, and the increase of flooding potential, and increased projections of sea level. But the one that we've put a lot of effort into is really this possible increase in the frequency and magnitude of compound extreme weather events. And we focus on this one while we can have a look at the impact of increasing temperatures on wind farm output and solar farm output and their impacts on resource adequacy from a year-to-year basis. It's really the compound extreme weather events that put the power system in a much more stressful situation, where power system security might be much more challenging to operate through, potentially leading to cascading failures, and or we'll end up in situations where there's a greater risk of consumer load shedding as a result. In terms of looking at the power system resilience to some of these compound extreme weather events, there's a few different ways that we're doing it. First, starting, AEMO is really looking at resilience from the lens of the C-grade definition, which is a resilient power system is one that's able to limit the extent, severity, and duration of system degradation following an extreme event. So we're not necessarily looking at it from the perspective of these are risks that need to be mitigated 100%, but how do we look at these risks? How do we understand the design and operational characteristics we can put in place that will allow us to respond quickly, absorb events where appropriate, and bounce back as quickly as possible where necessary? And we do that by looking at it through risk analysis and risk evaluation frameworks, so similar to what we would do in our reliability frameworks, trying to capture the chronic hazards, chronic impacts of climate change in a lot of those reliability and security calculations. One of the challenges we've got, though, is that the acute hazards, these compound extreme events, can be really challenging to include because one, the climate science isn't really there to be able to give us the probability of a lot of these compound extreme weather events. We can certainly say temperatures are getting hotter, but to be able to say what's the probability that a compound extreme event will occur, whether that be a big bushfire followed by a cold front or a coincident heat wave across the continent, it's really just not there to be able to assign those probabilities. And equally, the power system modelling is quite challenging to do, to be able to assign probabilities to all of these things, which would really include it for those sorts of standard risk analysis and risk evaluation frameworks. Second way we're looking at it is through planning standards. When doing this planning, what should be the appropriate response in the physical designs and technology solutions? In terms of resilience of the power system, a lot of these things are built into good planning practices. For example, the use of line route diversity when doing transmission planning and considering of fuel security. But we really need to give them an additional focus in the context of climate change and in the context of declining resilience. And then third is also the ability for the operator to come up with solutions to mitigate this, making sure the operators have got sufficient flexibility and the right procedures to be able to consider ways to mitigate these risks in operations. Now, really at looking at these compound extreme events, some of the work that we're doing now is to be able to take these events that we're getting from the meteorological and climate science organisations and look at whether or not what are the outcomes that we might expect from a future power system in response to these events. Now, the purpose of these case studies and the purpose of the work we're doing here is really to begin a conversation with industry, consumer groups, market bodies and governments to really look at the tolerability of these types of events and begin that conversation in advance as to whether or not there are cost-effective ways that some of these risks can be mitigated. Should they be mitigated through some upfront investments? Should they be mitigated through procedures and systems? And how do we balance that cost? So this particular case study, we're really looking at the future of the power system as we're transitioning to a power system with increasing amounts of variable renewable energy like wind and solar and less thermal facilities. How can we make sure that we're building that power system in a way that it's got the right level of resilience that's in the long-term interests of consumers? So this particular case study that we've done is looking at a single meteorological event, which we've set in the year of 2031. And not only is it a 2031 event meteorologically, but it's set in the power system of 2031 using our projections of the type of power system we're expecting to exist in 2031. You can see there on the right, I've shown the changing installed capacity that's expected from this particular projection moving from 2021 to 2031. This particular projection was done in our 2020 integrated system plan, but even then that's starting to look like the transition is happening faster than what that plan indicated. And the meteorological event we've added is taken from one of the climate models from a particular week in 2045, one of the Canadian climate models, but we've set that 1 week in 2031. What this compound event case study really looks at is what's the impact likely to be if we were to get a coincident national heat wave and bushfire event across the country in that future power system. This particular coincident heat wave is unique in the fact that it has so many of our states and so many of our demand centres simultaneously experiencing extremely high temperatures. It pretty much peaks in Melbourne with a 48-degree temperature, or that's about 118 degrees Fahrenheit. And what we've done is we've simulated what a likely consumer response would be to those temperatures, which is shown in the operational sent-out demand graph in the bottom. So we're able to take a meteorological event, simulate the consumer response to that, simulate the wind generation response, simulate the solar generation response, simulate the transmission response, and then identify what are the possible ways that the power system would respond to that, considering the ability of the power system to remain secure through that event, And of course, if it isn't able to maintain security through that event, the outcomes may potentially be worse. In addition to the coincident heat wave, this event is followed by a cold front. So it's a synoptically plausible, internally consistent event. And this type of synoptic pattern is quite common for Australia in that it has the heat followed by a cold front that tends to fan the bushfires. What makes this one interesting is it's set in the future, so it's supercharged by climate change effectively. Now, this cold front comes through bringing damaging winds that fan the bushfires, and as a result, impacts some of the transmission connection throughout the country. What we've been able to show in this case study is that the purple amount of USE in that chart on the right, what the point of that one is to show that in this event, would we have the right amount of resources to supply consumers? Effectively, it's showing that just because there's simultaneous heat waves across the demand centres, we would likely need to load shed across 3 of the regions because we're typically expecting and counting on a certain amount of sharing amongst the regions, which wouldn't be possible in this scenario. Secondly, when we add the bushfire, we see that we would need to load shed a lot more energy in the New South Wales region in particular. So it's actually quite similar to what we've observed in reality in 2019-20, but in the future power system as well. So just stopping on implications, I think the reason why we're really starting to look at these case studies is that we know that the events that we're going to get in the future aren't necessarily going to be the sort of events that we've observed in the past. We really want to begin that dialogue with industry participants, governments, consumers, etc., about what are the tolerable levels of outcomes that they should expect and through those events. And by doing some of the analysis up front, trying to identify where the lowest cost ways to mitigate some of these risks are, whether it is entirely solving the problem in operational timeframes and hoping that we can get the system back very, very quickly, or whether or not there are some ways that we can build resilience into the power system through line route diversity, through robust asset specifications, by making sure that the assets that are going into the power system are fit for purpose in the climate that we're expecting. And from a resource adequacy point of view and a resilience point of view, we're seeing that the Australian regulatory environment is already moving to be able to provide some more of that operational flexibility in operational timeframes. And this is in response to some of the events we've seen recently, like the South Australia System Black, the loss of that region, and the 2020 Black Summer bushfires. And we've also probably seen a change recently to the reliability standard, which is more in line with the societal expectation of probably a wide-scale outage, maybe once every 10 years, that makes that a little bit tighter. But we'll also argue that there's arresting the decline in resilience won't necessarily happen without further intervention. And further work is probably required to really better consider climate and resilience impacts in planning timeframes. So in a lot of our planning documents, we're really starting to look at, of all of the possible development pathways for the power system, how can we make sure that we're building resilience into that power system so that there is an ability to resist or an ability to bounce back or absorb some of these disaster events we're expecting in the future. And also there's a very big role for industry participants to make sure that their assets, to make sure that the way that they participate in the market is fit for purpose in a future climate and the sorts of events we're expecting to see. I'll finish up there.
Okay, very good. And listen, apologies to everyone, but I've had to use a camera that sort of looks up at my chin. I've got no choice in the matter, I'm afraid. So thanks, Ben. So just on the Slido, I think I've scared people off when I said please not be anonymous, because no questions have come in now since I said that. So if you want to be anonymous, please be anonymous. So I think what Ben just showed us as well is along the same lines as what Phil showed us. I mean, this is, we're starting to look at a situation here where resilience is important. Is that resource adequacy? How do they relate with each other? And that operations actually, how do you operate out of these issues? So maybe resource adequacy is too constraining a term for this session, but we'll see. So we're now going to have the audience participation part of this as an experiment. Ryan, so I'm going to give you 4 questions. I'm going to give you a little bit of time. It should pop up automatically on your screen. You should have no choice in the matter. There you go. So does everyone see it? So the questions here, the first question says, how well do you understand how resource adequacy is calculated? Very well, reasonable knowledge, and C, no real understanding. Now, I've scrolled through the list of people who are attending, and I have a rough estimate of what the answer should be. So let's see. So would you please vote? You've got a few seconds to do it. Just pick one of those. Come on, show a bit of party spirit. Click some things. I can even vote. Ryan, how many people have voted?
We've got about 50% voted so far.
Oh, come on, let's try get to 75%, for God's sake. 50% is not a good resource. That's not a good capacity value. Let's get higher.
Just a reminder to click on submit when you select your.
Oh yeah, I didn't even do that. When you click submit. How many do we have now?
65%.
That's fine. Cut it off. The other 35% are laggards. They're waiting. They're resting themselves up for the next question. Go with the next question. Oh, so go with the results.
Gives them. We've got 10 more seconds.
Oh, yeah, okay. It's giving them a certain amount of time, is it? So what I'm going to do, everybody, I'm just going to just show you the results, and it'll be good for our next 3 speakers to see these results, and it'll be good for the panel to understand, the answers to some of these for the audience, and we'll see what we'll do with them. Okay. Very interesting. I think that's so, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I don't mean to be, I would have predicted something like this, that most people have a reasonable knowledge, but they're not detailed in it. There's very few people are very detailed in it. So I think that would be what I'd expect. I think the point we're trying to make about this is got to do with the next question. Next question. So how important do you think it is to understanding is in accepting events and their consequences? So I think what we're trying to get at here is, if you understand how these things are calculated, are you more accepting of when stuff happens, so to speak? Yeah. So how important do you think it is for understanding and accepting events and their consequences? So question 1 and question 2 are linked. So please vote.
%.
They've got a certain period of time, do they?
Yeah, once I close it, they'll have 15 seconds.
Okay, close it now. You got 15 seconds, everyone. What's the response rate like?
We're at 62%.
Look at that. I give you all the vote in democracy and you don't use it. Shocking. I think in Australia you pay a fine if you don't vote, isn't that right? Okay, now that is interesting. And that's what I was hoping for. I didn't know this would happen, but I was hoping for this. So if you can all see, what it says is, for you to accept what happens, you need to really understand it. And what we've also said, and this is not very scientific, I suppose, but we've also said in the first question is, not too many people are that deep into it. And I think there's a mismatch there, which is what I was hoping for that answer. I was not expecting it. I was just hoping that this would happen. So that is interesting. So it's saying that there's a built-in mismatch going on here. You need to understand it very well to accept it. And yet, at the same time, even the audience here accepts that not many of them are very expert in it. Now, it's not a very scientific thing we're doing, but I think that is very interesting, extremely interesting. I don't know if you think it's interesting, but I do. Okay, next question. So we've got another 2 questions. This is more around so the question very simply is resource adequacy a technical issue, economic issue, or both? Please vote. How are we doing, Ryan?
We're at 60%, and we're going to have a landslide.
Right, okay. That's fair enough. I don't even need to know. Go on, just cut it off. I hope
It's
the
got-
answer is. I hope the answer is both. If it's not, we have a. We should fire all of
Open
you.
me. We have 10 seconds and I'll share the results.
Too easy, yeah. Yeah, okay, that's fine. I would actually argue, everybody, that it's actually just an economic issue, because you can always take, well, anyway, that's neither here nor there. You can always equate technical issues to money, but no, I think that's a good answer. That shows that people are insensible about this. The next question might be a little bit less landslidey, I would suspect. Next question. So, how important is market design to maintaining resource adequacy? Or is it too important to be dealt with by pure market mechanism? So, please vote. But just to be clear, if you think that market design is absolutely fundamentally important to resource adequacy, click A. If it's moderately important, click B. And if you don't think it's important at all, click C. This is not a landslide by Rebecca and Ryan, is that right?
It is not. We are at 60%.
Well, I'm not going to go any further until we get to 70. So people want to get home tonight, keep clicking. Okay, close it up, Ryan.
Okay, it's got 15 seconds left.
I'd say this is even Stevens, roughly. Oh, it's not even Stevens, okay. But it is even Stevens between moderately important and very important. Okay. And I think that shows, that is reflective of what is actual reality, that some people, the debate around resource adequacy sort of flips between pure market and it's too important. So I think that's, but not, yeah, not important, getting very little is interesting. I think that is interesting, is that most people believe that the market has some role in this. Okay, we will use that, the poll answers later on, possibly in the Q&A session, and we'll move on. Okay, thanks everyone for participating. And look, on Slido, I didn't mean to scare people off, but would you please go back to Slido and ask some questions? Otherwise, we'll have no questions from you. Okay, our next speaker is David Bones. I've just realized, actually, in reading this, so David has 30 years experience in this industry. He's worked with AEMO and various other people. But I just realized that he currently leads GHD's advisory risk assurance and regulation business area. And I also realized, David, that our friend and colleague Christian Schaefer just started with you recently. Is that correct?
That's very true.
Yeah, and he's online as well, somewhere there. He can't say anything, so you and I can speak rudely about him, and he can't respond. Okay, David, it's over to you. So look, the next three speakers, everyone, are going to give a much shorter presentation, and then we'll have the panel questions. Okay, David, go for it. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Mark, and great to be with everyone today. What I'm going to do in my presentation is just share a few insights from an event that happened in Australia in 2016, which was a South Australian blackout. It's really focused around the question of resilience, and I think one of the things we learned through the South Australian event is you shouldn't presume that the power system that's been resilient in the past will be resilient in the future unless you actively investigate whether that is true. So I'm going to just summarize what went on in 2016 and then have a look at some of the changes that have occurred since then. These are focused more around operationally managing through events better. So South Australia, and many thanks to Ben for positioning what Australia looks like for our overseas audience. So South Australia is right on the tail end of the national electricity grid. It's very loosely connected into the rest of the grid by 275 kV transmission lines down at the southeast corner of the state. That's the only synchronous interconnection between South Australia and the rest of the NEM. South Australia has a very high renewable energy penetration, lots of wind and solar. So what happened in September 2016? We had a large weather event brewed up over the ocean and moved across most of the state. Within that weather event, there was a whole lot of lightning, a lot of thunderstorm activities, some high wind, pockets of high wind that were somewhat exceeded forecast, and some small localized tornado events. That resulted in damage to 3 transmission lines and a whole lot of disturbances on the power system. We discovered that some of the wind farms in particular had an inability to ride through those disturbances. All of this manifested itself with a big power swing on the interconnector that exceeded stability limits. The interconnector tripped, and what we found then was we had a region that had very little primary frequency response within the region. There was very little synchronous plant online at the time because we'd been depending on renewable resources to a large extent. The frequency collapsed very quickly, around about 6 hertz a second. None of the emergency control schemes were able to really do anything to arrest the event, and we went into a complete system black event. So this all happened about 4:20 in the afternoon. By 4:30, AEMO had started the process of restoring supply, and by midnight, about 80 to 90% of the load was back being resupplied. The bit that was not able to be supplied was because the transmission circuits were damaged and there needed to be bypasses erected over the coming days. Interestingly, also, the wholesale market was suspended at the time of the collapse, and it did not get reinstated for 12 days after the event. The cost, various estimates are around as to what the event cost, but one of those talked about a cost of about 367 million. So you can see a fairly expensive event, and you'd expect after all of these major events, there's a lot of reviews. Australia was no different. I'm just focused here on a couple of the reviews by the standing bodies within the Australian industry. So AEMO, as a system operator, did a system incident review, looking to see what lessons could be learned. The AEMC, who is our rule maker, also did a review. And particularly, I think the focus of the AEMC review is interesting in that they asked, well, has this really highlighted that there are new hazards or new risks for the power system that we need to consider? And are our existing approaches adequate for considering those risks? A whole series of rule changes came out of the reviews, and some of those rule change processes are still ongoing. I'm just going to quickly highlight 2 of them and give you a worked example of how they've combined to provide a more resilient power system. And that's the first 2 that are listed there on the right in terms of the power system frequency risk review and the protected event framework. One of the things that came out of the review of the South Australian event was a recognition that there were transmission lines throughout South Australia that were actually vulnerable to the more extreme high wind events. So you could get disturbances on the transmission network moving forward. The power system characteristics had changed in that there was now a lot of renewable energy connected in those more remote parts of South Australia. And as a result of the higher levels of renewables, you didn't have as much dependable, dispatchable synchronous plant running routinely within the state. So this meant that the characteristics of the system had changed. It was more vulnerable to this sort of event occurring again. The problem was that the frameworks for the dealing of things operationally really didn't handle this sort of broad scale event where you couldn't anticipate very well exactly which corridor or which transmission line would be impacted. So we needed a different way of looking at things. And the protected event framework allows that to happen. It allows AEMO to say, we've now got this new event that we have to deal with. It is a very acute hazard in that it can lead to a system collapse. It's therefore prudent to have an investigation to see, are there cost-effective measures that we can put in place to allow us to ride through that event more effectively. And so one of the solutions that came through that protected event framework was a special protection scheme that's been implemented now by the transmission network operator in South Australia. And it involves protecting the large power change and taking some very quick control actions to prevent the disconnection of South Australia and therefore moderate the risk of system collapse. The other thing, the other outcome from the review that really feeds into this was the power system frequency risk review. So you can say this is great that you've discovered this event after the fact, but really what you want to be doing is looking for where there are opportunities to make the power system more resilient and doing that ahead of time. And that's where the institutionalised change to require a power system risk review to be undertaken on a routine basis is really quite important. And so that was a change to the regulations requiring the system operator to undertake those reviews. And I think it's really important to have a concrete requirement to do things, otherwise they can get lost in amongst everything else that the system operator needs to be focused on. Some of the other lessons learned that came out of 2016 was really a recognition that you're never going to build out every event. So you also need to, when you're thinking of resilient, realise that you will get widespread outages from time to time, and you need to have the systems in place that allow you to restore the power system afterwards. And so that means investing in your system restart plans. I think one of the things to bear in mind there as well is, as the power system is evolving, you've also got to ask questions, will your restart plan be effective for the power system as it exists today, as perhaps the power system was when you designed a restart plan? And there's this question around managing stakeholder expectations around the risks that the power system is exposed to and whether that's matching up with stakeholder expectations. One of the big learnings from the 2016 event after the fact was there was really no tolerance from a wide range of stakeholders to the concept that the power system should become less resilient with time through this change to a greater proportion of renewables. The expectation was that we would maintain resilience at about historical levels. One of the interesting things that worked quite well, I think, in the South Australian concept was that the rules for the NEM had always built in decision criteria around when the market should be suspended and a regime for allowing then a considered view as to when to reactivate the market following that suspension. And I think those processes actually worked quite well in the South Australian event. And you can imagine it's much better to have those criteria defined in advance than trying to work out during an event whether or not the market should be suspended. And I think that some of the reviews afterwards was to make sure that when you do suspend the markets, you don't, as a consequence, impede the ability of the system operator to manage through an event. So there's some interesting lessons there, I think, from that South Australian Black event, particularly with respect to our power system resilience. I might just pause at that point.
Okay. Thank you, David. Just for this information, my one of my screens went. I don't have an IT problems here, but you are asking questions, just that my screen apparently didn't update, so there is questions coming in. Sorry about that. I thought I'd frozen. Okay, David. So I think David has given a very quick overview of the South Australian event, and I think there's a lot of common themes going on between the first three speakers. Our next speaker will be Erik. So Erik is with EPRI. He's a principal at EPRI. He has lots of roles and responsibilities. I think the most important from this regard is that he runs a market operations and market design advisory group that's made up of a lot of stakeholders. And he's previously worked with NREL and New York ISO, and he's also very heavily involved with ESIG. Okay, Erik, over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark. So I just have a series of kind of different thoughts on resource adequacy across a couple different topics. And, I'll mention that at EPRI, we're kicking off a fairly large initiative on sort of relooking or reevaluating resource adequacy across many of these different aspects. So I'm just going to kind of go and touch on each of them and look forward to the Q&A. So I think this is something that, we've talked a little bit about in some of the other previous slides is, we tend historically, based on the methods and metrics that we use to think about resource adequacy, really looking at, capacity, whether that's installed capacity or unforced capacity, but really kind of, the megawatts that's installed there on the system. And I think what we're learning across, many of these different aspects is that it's more than that. It's not just that installed megawatts, but it's can you provide the energy up to that, installed megawatt capacity at the times where it's most critical to do so? Do you also have the flexibility to accommodate changes in system conditions? And then also, and this is obviously related to flexibility, sometimes we put them together, but the system services, the reliability services, things like having adequate frequency control and voltage control, et cetera. So, we tend to think of those as, more operations focused, but, we should think about whether all of these attributes are part of the future fleet that's being built. That doesn't necessarily mean there needs to be markets for these or anything like that. It's just making sure that as planners, when we're looking at what does a resource, adequate system look like, we need to look across each of these different components together and not just looking at the installed capacity in megawatts. So we thought that, it would be hard to skip over the ERCOT event in its entirety. So I was kind of volunteered just to share a couple thoughts about it, but, probably won't be able to answer too many detailed questions, but I will mention that at EPRI, we've been, obviously, we spend some time evaluating when these types of events happen to kind of look at root causes, and as part of this resource adequacy initiative, looking at the historical events to see, are there enhancements that can be made across metrics, studies, scenarios, et cetera, is important to do. So, it was a demand and a supply issue altogether, right? So it wasn't one or the other. I think in terms of the numbers from a demand perspective, so it says here it's 10 gigawatts greater than the prior winter peak that happened in 2011. I think it was 17 gigawatts higher than sort of the 50-50 expected winter peak. And I believe 7 gigawatts higher than the absolute, anticipated extreme weather winter peak that may have happened. So it was high. Of course, more demand or more of the heating demand is electric than perhaps it was, maybe even 10 years ago. Of course, over the last 20 years, that's shifted a lot. And then, of course, we know that there were a number of supply outage issues. That 50% number, I think that's based on installed capacity. So, of course, if you're looking at nameplate capacity of wind, it's kind of, those numbers might look a little odd, but, if you use that nameplate capacity, I believe it was 57 gigawatts of outage. And I think the next slide kind of shows it in maybe a different way that might be a little bit more helpful. But it was weather issues, of course. It was equipment issues. There was fuel supply issues. There was even outages from a frequency, under frequency that were caused. So, and I believe, the ERCOT just released a report that kind of shared some of the information on the causes to outages just either earlier this week or last week. And so load shed happened, of course, a larger number than we saw in the California events of last summer. And so these numbers coming out here, 800 gigawatt hours across that entire period with a peak of 27 gigawatts, which is obviously very large. And then we saw some, not quite as large, but some load shed in SPP, MISO, and Sonase in Mexico as well. So a lot of different things come out of this. I'll talk about a little bit of these in each of the subsequent slides. Scenario planning, how do you look at future trends, including how climate change impacts might be causing greater impacts to the electric power system. Metrics, looking at magnitude and duration, and of course, looking across not just the peak load period, but looking across all those critical time periods. Design criteria to reflect future consequences, looking at performance in a future context. How does weatherization come into play when you're doing planning, and the amount of weatherized facilities that might have higher probabilities of outage during these types of conditions. And then, of course, also incorporating common mode in interdependent impacts. So, realizing that every outage is not independent of another outage is a very important thing to consider. This is another way of showing, I'm not going to go into detail because I'm supposed to keep to 5 minutes, but just kind of a hopefully useful chart. This is showing the seasonal assessment of resource adequacy. You can think of this as the capacity value or the UCAP of all of the aggregate of all these different technology types with the dashed line, and then the actual production with the solid line. And then what you're seeing on the right-hand side there is the actual performance over this entire time period, the entire 3 days here, percentage of energy compared to that SARA capacity, the resource adequacy number. So, obviously these have different implications, and there's lots of different things you can use with this data. It's not really, you can't just look at the numbers and just, assume it there, but there was issues across the board, right? From a supply side, it wasn't just one technology. It was, really across the board, and of course on the demand side as well. So getting into the different key things that we're looking at in our resource adequacy initiative, and that we're encouraging folks to consider, and many are already doing so. One, projecting the event probabilities into the future. The sort of the historical experience does not, necessarily account for what you might see in the future, particularly when you're looking at the types of events that we're seeing, as well as things like how climate change might be impacting load in the future or renewable production. Really, this is not just for weather, but in terms of outages, economic impacts on load, et cetera. But the conditions and scenarios that you're using and the probabilities of the events that could cause these types of impacts need to be adjusted for the future impacts, both in terms of climate trends and other things that might be changing how we historically have been using probabilities in these types of analyses. Another part is that operations may affect resource adequacy, and this is something I'm more of an operations guy than a planning guy, so I think this is kind of a new thing to think about. We tended historically to say, planners, just give me a system that I can operate, and then I'll operate it. Don't worry about how I'm going to operate it. I'll take care of that. But when you think about, storage, demand response technologies, that if you operate them in different ways, that might impact how they contribute to resource adequacy. So having a knowledge about, the fact that a unit that can start up in 10 minutes, today would have the same capacity value or effective load carrying capability as the same size unit that takes 12 hours to start up and might have 24-hour minimum downtime, et cetera. So, how you operate the system, some of those attributes can come in to actually affect that. This is a study we did with the California ISO a couple of years ago that looked at their effective flexible capacity, really looking at their the amount of flexibility needed from a resource adequacy perspective. And we showed that, well, if you just sum up the 3-hour ramps for your entire fleet, that's not really giving you the whole picture, because what happens? You shut down units at noontime because of the high solar, and those units have minimum downtimes, they have startup times, et cetera. They can't actually ramp up at all times to be ready for that large afternoon, early evening ramp up. And so actually knowing that feasible amount of flexibility in this case, but it can refer to capacity as well, is important to consider. And then finally, market design and market clearing software is something, of course, I'm passionate about. In both the California summer event and the ERCOT events this February, there were things that happened from a market clearing software perspective that were not expected. There were some issues with CAISO's reliability unit commitment, how it treated exports, and as well as how it utilized the convergence bidding and some of the differences between the day-ahead market and its reliability commitment. There were some things that happened with prices in ERCOT that were not anticipated. We had ancillary service prices as high as maybe I think it was $24,000 per megawatt hour, and everyone thought, well, how's that possible? And you know, so one of the things here is that should we be doing more market clearing software tests using these extreme conditions to kind of see, you know, what happens? We tend to think, oh, you know, we don't need to think about those things from a market perspective. Let's analyze them from the reliability perspective. But it becomes very difficult to make changes once you've had these issues that happen. And in some cases, and potentially in the California case, it could actually have had contributed to the reliability issues as well, just because of some simple, you know, line of code that maybe wasn't anticipated. So that's an important thing. You know, we don't like to get into the debates too much around, you know, broader market design issues, but the question comes up from, for example, in ERCOT, would a capacity market have made a difference? Or would having some kind of, you know, quote unquote winterization product in the sufficient incentive? We don't know that. You know, there's a lot of that Monday morning quarterback that comes with, you know, can a market design make a difference or not? There's lots of theories, but it's hard to say which designs will improve things. And then who decides RA contribution? Is it the technologies that do it, or is it the system operator or someone else that can have a big impact? And then finally, and I think Arne might talk a little bit on this as well, is you know, what should consumers actually pay during these types of conditions? We saw very high bills for consumers in February, and is that really, you know, is that what we're going for, or is there some other type of insurance or something like that needs to be put in place? So lots of other, you know, could talk a while on all these things, but I just wanted to highlight a few of kind of the key components I wanted to bring up in terms of resource adequacy going forward. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, thanks, Erik. Okay, so we'll just move on because we're going to get to questions now very shortly. So our next speaker is Arne Olsen. He's with EPRI for 25 years. So Arne has agreed to, well, he's volunteered to tidy up here. So you got 5 minutes to tidy up and make us all look good. Arne, over to you.
Perfect. Yeah, well, thanks, Mark. Really honored to be here on the panel today. And I think, you know, that is my role, is to play cleanup and pick things up, make things all neat. And in that spirit, I do have just one slide where I want to tie together some of the threads that have mentioned really throughout the panel. And I want to start, Mark, with kind of where you left off, which is that these practices on how to calculate resource adequacy, how to think about making a system adequate, have been around, excuse me, for an awful long time. So you talked about the ELCC paper having been around for 10 years. Well, you know, ELCC is a derivative, and quite literally, mathematically, a derivative of the loss of load probability type of studies, and those techniques have been around for 50 years or more. But I want to start just by observing that we have a long way to go, even to get everyone to be using those best practices today. And particularly in the North American context, it may be shocking for people to understand that there's not really a federal role in resource adequacy. There are no federal standards. There are no NERC standards for resource adequacy. And that's true in Canada and in the US as well. So what that means is that each power system, and there are, you know, dozens and dozens of them throughout North America, is left to design its own resource adequacy standard, figure out how it's going to measure that resource adequacy performance, which models it's going to use, how to gather up all the data, and, you know, each state commission with perhaps elected utility commissioners, perhaps elected board members of municipal utilities, they're all left to make those decisions on their own. And so, as you can imagine, there's a broad range of practices that exist out there. You know, there are some academic best standards. There are some industry working groups that have published best practices guides and those types of things, but not everyone is using them. And so where are we doing a good job in North America? The organized markets are doing a good job. And there are some vertically integrated utilities that are doing a good job of looking at loss of load probability on their own system and trying to understand the impact of these extreme events. But there are some exceptions. And within the organized market group, some of the exceptions might sound familiar. Places where we're not using best practices today are Texas and California. And in the rest of the West, and Phil talked about this a little bit, the relationship of the CAISO to the rest of the West, we have a real resource adequacy problem. We've had a surplus for 15, 20 years in the West coming out of the Enron crisis. And utilities in the Western US have fallen into the habit of relying, quote unquote, on the market for purchases of capacity rather than building their own resources or doing their own studies to know whether their systems will be resource adequate. And that worked great as long as we had the surplus. But today we're now moving into a condition of deficit as we're retiring a lot of coal resources and even some gas resources without firm plans for how to replace the firm capacity that we're losing at a time when our loads are really beginning to grow rapidly again. So, we're not using best practices today. We have a lot of work to do to get people into what are today's best practices. That's number one. Number two is that today's best practices might not be enough to assure resource adequacy in the future. And Ben talked about this a lot, and David and Erik touched on it as well. The climate's changing, we know that. We've observed already much more frequent weather events, both in the wintertime and in the summertime, that are in our historical record. And our best practices today are really based on the probabilistic assessment of historical weather. So that's how we calculate resource adequacy one day in 10 years, as we look at all the weather that we've observed, and we simulate how our power systems perform during all the weather that we know about. Well, if the weather is changing, is that process still going to be robust to ensure resource adequacy in the future? And I think we all can understand intuitively the answer is no. Does that mean that we throw out our existing methods? I don't know that I would go that far. I still don't know of a better way to do this than to gather up all the information that you can find about what the weather might be and simulate how your system performs under potential future weather. So I think we do need to stick with loss of load probability, but there's a lot of work being done now on how you extend your historical weather sets. Is there a trend to them where temperatures are just increasing? Are there more and more frequent extreme events? Are the extreme events, do they last longer? Are they more extreme than they have been in the past? How do we stretch our weather data to do a better job of evaluating potential future weather states? The third observation I want to make, and it really pains me to have to make this one, but it's true, that the transition to clean energy resources is creating challenges for resource adequacy. And when I say it pains me to say this, there's a couple of reasons for that. I work with a consulting company where every person in the company is dedicated. The reason why they're doing this is because they're dedicated to making the transition to clean energy resources real. And they're dedicated to making sure that it happens reliably. And it pains me to say it because I've been going around for 10 years saying that you can operate systems with high penetrations of wind and solar resources reliably. I wrote a paper with First Solar and Tampa Electric Company on how to make flexible solar work for the system and what are the benefits of operating your solar power plants flexibly. And those solar and wind plants can be operated very flexibly if they have the power plant controllers and they have the dispatch control from the control center. They're very, very fast responding resources, very, very flexible. What they can't do is generate energy when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. So we need to be able to piece together a portfolio of resources that together is adequate. That does mean that our wind and solar resources are going to have to be backed up with something more firm, where there's multi-day periods or even single-day periods where you just don't have enough. So it's painful because it's possible to do this. There is no reason why we can't do this. The challenge is that we have a hard time accepting the fact that we need some of these backup resources that are firm. And today, the answer is simply that gas capacity is needed until there's some substitute. And maybe it's hydrogen, maybe that'll come along faster than we had all expected, and that'll be the substitute that's available in the near term. There's other potential solutions out there, long duration storage, nuclear, carbon capture. There's a list of potential firm resources. We'll need those as part of our transition to lower carbon energy systems. In the meantime, we have to make sure that the transition is reliable. And the only way that we can do that is to accept that gas is going to have a role. And that might mean in some places that we have to build some new gas resources in order to make sure that we can keep the lights on in the near term while we're transitioning over time to a much lower carbon electricity system. And then lastly, and this kind of ties back to what David talked about a little bit, and Erik as well, is that we've seen instances now, several of them, where despite our best designs, our markets have failed. We need to now understand how resilient our systems are, and not just physically resilient, but how economically resilient our systems are to these extreme events that we are going to see in the future. There will be more times in the future where we run out of capacity, and it might be a day, or it might be multiple days again. And what we need to avoid, I think, is where that event becomes a way for large amounts of money to be transferred from consumers to whichever producers are lucky enough to have had their resources available during that time. Transfers that no longer are way past what serves any legitimate purpose related to energy economic efficiency. Certainly we need price signals to invest in resources that can perform during those times. But if it's now the third day of the crisis and it's clear that there's nothing else gonna show up on that third day, and with the first 2 days have been enough to pay for a whole fleet of new resources, you have to understand, you have to recognize that the damage that's being done is significant. And I worry that our markets won't survive many more of these events. And we saw that happen in California in 2000. The Enron electricity crisis killed the electricity market for retail access in California. It killed the wholesale market development throughout the West. We're still struggling to recover from the damage that caused to our collective confidence in the ability of our market institutions to operate the system reliably. So we need to be able to recognize when the markets failed and have some breaks and some safety nets. And I was really interested to note in David's presentation that the market was in fact suspended in Australia during the event that he described, because it just wasn't going to function. So those are some observations. Hope they're helpful, and really looking forward to the Q&A.
Okay, so we've got through it all. Thanks, Arne. So listen, I've got lots of questions here in Slido. We have maybe some things to discuss on the basis of the panel or the participation of the audience. So I'm going to start off with one or two questions, and then I'll seed a few of the questions from Slido into how I'm doing this. Oh, very good. Thanks. I asked Ryan, could you do this? He's just in time. Thanks, Ryan. So let's just look at the responses to the participation of the audience, whatever. I think question 1 and question 2 combined make an interesting point. I think question 3 is it was a landslide, so it's not that important. And there's something in question 4 we could talk about. But look at question 1. We're basically saying that, it's to understand and accept events, you really do need to understand how these calculations are done. I admit this is a very simplistic design I've had, and I'm not saying it's scientifically completely valid, but it appears as a mismatch. We have a calculation method that very few people, or the minority people, understand very well, but yet most people accept that unless you understand it very well, you won't accept the results. That indicates a mismatch for me. At least that's in my head. And just to what David just said, just to be clear, David, when I mentioned the ELCC, yeah, I know it started back in the 1960s. When it was applied to wind was back in the 2010, just to clarify that. But I think that, the whole issue of ELCC, for example, there's one of the questions that's come in, someone has asked, ELCC is a fine concept for understanding resource adequacy, but is it relevant to future grids with dispatchable load? So that's another question of knowledge, etc. So here's my question to the panel, rolling all those together. Should we be using these type of calculations? Because if these type of calculations are not matching up with when the event happens, you get this backlash because people don't understand it. Maybe we should do a calculation that may not be as good, but let's say that society accepts it more. I mean, it's a second best solution from a technical point of view, but it might be better. It might be better to have these large events with the public, not having this large backlash against the event. Now, I just want to know, does that make any sense to anyone? So Arne, you're still, could everyone turn on their cameras so I can see them? So Arne, you're first there. Do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I was one of the ones that said that understanding how these calculations are done is only moderately important. And I kind of go back to, these are really technical questions. And I don't think that we can expect our elected public service commissioners to really be able to understand the statistics and the engineering behind the calculation methods. I think it's always going to be a select few stakeholders that really understand that. The best to me that we can do is publish standards that are best practices. I would ideally like them to be federalized so that the experts can really look at these and say, this is how we ought to calculate what resource adequacy is. This is how we ought to think about answering the question quantitatively. We don't ask consumers and stakeholders to weigh in on how to make an airplane safe. So I don't know that we need to have them weigh in on how to make our electricity systems technically resource adequate. Now they can certainly weigh in on which resources they might prefer to meet policy goals like more clean energy and lower carbon systems. But these are just very inherently technically difficult problems that I think that the experts ought to be left to solve.
The airplane analogy I don't think is good, because I hate to be brutal about it, but only a couple of hundred people die, not the whole society gets impacted. But anyway, I hear Phil getting in there. Phil?
Yeah, and you won't be, I don't think you'll be too surprised to hear that I'm not that far off from where Arne's at. In fact, I also voted for moderately important because of the exact same reasons that Arne just mentioned. So I won't belabor those. What I was going to do is touch on the point that you were making, Mark, and raising one of the questions we had in the Slido related to the ELCC. And so maybe touch on two of the questions that was there, because one of them was, is it really a shortage of capacity or a shortage of the right capacity? And I would say, why would we create that kind of difference? The answer is capacity is not really all that helpful if it doesn't help us serve load in the right places and right times. So of course it's the right capacity. And that leads us into the ELCC conversation. And to your point, Mark, is ELCC, for example, a good calculation tool? And I would say, well, it's one of the better ones that we have available to us today. And here's the story I would say, and Arne, chime in and help me if I get this a little bit off, but we shouldn't forget that probably as little as 8-9 years ago, solar resources in the California RA program were accounting towards something 70 or 80% of their nameplate capacity value. And then just very few years ago, ELCC was put in place to actually measure the effectiveness of those solar resources to serve the very peak loads that I was talking about. And of course, what we found is on a marginal basis, the solar was producing almost zero value on a marginal brand new plant basis. And on a total basis, then the total capacity value declined. And it declined every year that those calculations were being created. And we ended up with something about a 50% reduction in the value of solar resources to California's RA program. Well, that's why I was making the point in my presentation. If we're going to go from 80% of nameplate to about 30% of nameplate, we've got to respond by filling in that 50% of capacity in the solar space that's now being lost because it's not effectively serving the loads that we have on the system. So that being said, we have these tools, but we can't forget that they are giving us indications about where there are potential problems in the RA program. And the last thing I wanted to say is all of this, we got to remember that typically most of the RA construct is literally only looking out about 1 year in advance. And I really appreciated the point you made, Arne, that if we want to start looking at climate issues and so forth, we've got to recognize that some of those climate issues may not show up in the next 12 months. So how will we make sure we have enough capacity to solve that climate risk 2, 3, 4 years from now?
Okay.
So that's what I had to offer. Thanks.
Yeah, that's fine, Phil. So look, what I'm going to do now is, because there's lots of questions that I want to try to get good coverage. So I'm going to leave the other three, unless, does anyone, the other three really want to jump in on that? If they don't, I'm going to move on, because I think just to cover a bigger space, okay? So if that's okay, just to pick up on the point that we picked one of those questions out there about the resource adequacy calculation, but there's another point in there that says, someone said, and I think it was I don't want you to answer Phil, but it says, when will the CPUC still gives RA to solar? When's this going to stop? And that's, I think, along the lines of what you were talking about, Phil. I also would like to point out that Mahesh has a question about, can we quantify the reduction in resiliency as an impact on climate change, and the difference between that and variable renewable resources? And you, David, you were sort of indicating that maybe resiliency is going to drop as we put more renewables on the system. So if you tie all those, if you take those 3 points together, it looks like there's sort of a tendency, a trend here to people think things are going to get less resilient or less reliable. Let's just keep it fairly broad. Do you think it's going to become less resilient, David? I mean, do you think that's just a fait accompli?
I think that unless you're actively testing and putting in measures to prevent a decline, then the decline is likely to occur. I think the real lesson in terms of aligning, and what we're talking about here is highly technical calculations aligned with stakeholder expectations. I think the broad stakeholder expectation is that things shouldn't be allowed to get less resilient. As the custodians of the complex calculations, I think we need to be ahead of the game. And if we're seeing things declining, it's really around that to engage the conversation with the wider policymakers and in that sort of context. And that was one of the big lessons that came out of the South Australian blackout. We had federal reviews come out of that event, and really what drove that was a bit of a shock that we were on this path towards accepting a lower level of resilience. And that was really because the system was becoming exposed to different failure modes to what it had been in the past.
Okay, and then to you, Dave, or sorry, not David, Ben. Ben, I see you nodding your head there. I mean, Ben, resilience. I mean, you seem to be agreeing with what David is saying. Is that correct? That we
Yes,
need to
definitely.
sort of, yeah.
Definitely, and I think it is worth differentiating between reliability and resilience in this case, that
Yeah.
we could end up with a power system that is very reliable, i.e. to the failure modes and the probabilities that we've calculated, to the definition of reliability as to what we use. It meets those characteristics and it has the probability as an acceptable means. But then we've got a whole heap of failure modes and events which fall outside of that definition of reliability, which will stress the power system in ways which is not being measured in that probabilistic calculation, and that requires that special consideration, and that real focus on re-engaging with society as to whether or not. I agree entirely with David that we are approaching it from a perspective of what are the steps we need to put in place to maintain a level of resilience we've seen in the past. And I think that requires us to re-engage with society about what are some of the changes that are required in the way we operate and the way that we plan the power system to maintain that.
So could I venture, Ben, and maybe this is unfair, that AEMO are been very clever in how they react to this, because they know that ultimately this is about how the public react. Is that so? You are essentially taking on my advice, so to speak, if you know what I mean. I'm sort of saying, can you align the calculations to the public perception? You seem to be indicating that is behind some of the way you're thinking. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing, but is that fair? There is a bit of that, is there?
Definitely need to bring society on the journey on this one, and the state and federal governments as representatives for that. And I think it's we've already engaged in quite a lot of conversations about how reliable we want the power system to be, and as a result, we've engaged and figured out processes for now that will get reviewed in the next couple of years. And I think now it's really upon us to engage in those conversations again around how resilient we want the power system to be, and how we trade off those costs versus outcomes on behalf of consumers.
Okay, and then Erik, just for you, I mean, you're a market expert, I'd say. You know, that's your main love in life, I suppose, designing markets, whatever. What is this? Because all this seems to be operational. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here is not planning, it's sort of operational stuff. How does this affect the markets, you know, operationally? Is there need for new products, or, you know, I think it has some impact on these markets, doesn't it? The way that these guys are talking is that we must plan for these resilient events and must deal with them operationally. How does that affect the market design?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think there's still not a agreed upon definition for resilience that you can sort of put metrics to it, which makes that still a little bit difficult. But, you know, of course, markets, you know, there's complexities with how long, you know, it should happen and at what point there should be suspension. But, you know, there are ways of incentivizing supply during critical events, and that's all in place today. So, you know, kind of, you know, a question of, you know, I kind of think of it as, you know, people start asking the question of, are there the incentives, for example, to, you know, winterize or weatherize the supply fleet? And, you know, and people would argue that some market regions don't do that today, some do, and I think that they all do, and I think it's just it's a difference of how it's done. It's more of like, you know, is the market saying, you know, here's what I want you to be, here's the attribute I want you to have, I'll pay you if you have the attribute, and then we think we're good? Or is it, you know, hey, figure out, you know, what you need to do to perform during these conditions, and if you perform, I'll make sure you're compensated and you have those incentives. And, you know, there's pros and cons to each of those philosophies. And of course, you know, you consider like a capacity market with requirements on fuel security as kind of the former, and then the, you know, energy only market in ERCOT in Australia as the latter. And there's pros and cons to each of those that I think need to be just kind of thought through. And you know, whether or not there's explicit, you know, things incentivizing attributes that we see are needed in the future, I think whether or not that's the case, it's helpful for system operators, for researchers and others to start looking forward at what those attributes need to be, or, you know, or how they need to be, you know, developed in aggregate to meet, you know, the performance that we need based on these increasing events. So that's sort of the important part. And then how you do it, you know, I think that kind of depends.
Okay, and I think that really explains to some extent the answer of the audience to question 4, which is that, you know, some people think the market is very important, some people think it's moderately important. But going on to Rob Gramlich has a good question, which I think follows on from something you just said, Erik. You said there's no metric for, you know, well, so far there's no metric for resilience. My own opinion is that there will never be a metric for resilience because it's far too difficult. So, but Rob's question is, to what extent should resilience stress testing work be unique scenario-based analysis as opposed to standardized with generic methods and metrics? So that's essentially what, you know, what you were saying, Erik. So to the other 4 panelists, does anyone, you know, I mean, the way you were describing it, Ben, you seem to be scenario driven. I mean, resource adequacy was always based on metrics. You know, you had loss of load expectation, you did your calculation, you got it right, that's it, done. You're more along the line of scenarios. So are you basically saying that this is the way it's going to be? And I think it has to be that way because of what Erik just said. There is no metric, so how do you do it? You know?
Yeah, that's exactly the conclusions that we came to. And I think we're challenged with climate change a lot is that if you look at an individual asset, or if you look at an individual problem and you look at the climate change signal on that individual asset, many of the times you will conclude that the impacts of climate change are immaterial. A couple of degree impact may not have a massive impact, or it's within design specifications. But once you zoom out and look at the system impact of climate change, you find a lot more of these compound extreme events which really stress test the impact, because you end up with impacts simultaneously across all of the assets at the same time in a way that could really destabilize the system. in work that we did with Australia's science agencies, we really looked at some of the international approaches in other industries as well, and said, well, there are some of the impacts of climate change that we can assess probabilistically, but there's actually a lot of these impacts of climate change that we're just not able to assess in a probabilistic framework. And yet, if we ignore them in the probabilistic frameworks, we're ignoring a whole tranche of risks which really have big impacts for society. So we've looked at some other industries, and we've looked at even, say, the financial services sector in England that uses climate change stress test case studies to try and stress test whether the banks are going to be robust to a variety of disaster scenarios. And we believe that there's some value in using that to stress test power systems to identify what some of those extreme events might look like, and then begin those conversations free from a probabilistic conversation, but start to look at them and see whether or not there are cost-effective ways of mitigating those risks, and engage in the conversations about tolerability.
Okay, good. I'm going to move on now to another topic because we've got 10 minutes left here. But there's a question here, and it's posed at Phil. But Phil, I'm not going to ask you to answer it because it says, Phil, do the California politicians accept responsibility for their RA decisions? And that's not a question I'd ask you for sure. But I'm going to ask Arne, would he? And not so much that question, Arne, because that's a bit provocative. I mean, basically, from what I can see, from what everyone is speaking about, this includes Australia. There seems to be a lot of organizations involved here. I mean, in Australia, you've got the AEMO and the AECM, and there's just lots of acronyms going around, and in California, CPUC and whatever. Is that part of the problem? Is just who is really responsible? In the end of the day, would it not be a good idea to have one person, one entity, clearly, absolutely, unambiguously responsible for this? And if things go wrong, they get blamed. Because at the moment, it appears there doesn't seem to be any one person, entity responsible. And then what happens is this blame gets pushed around. Is that a fair assessment of what's happening in reality, and why is that?
I mean, I think it's partly fair, but maybe partly not. Let me explain that this way. You know, we do have most places entities that are running the grid that are either private entities or maybe they're quasi-governmental entities like the CAISO. It's not that they're answerable to no one. So we have technical experts in place to do their jobs, and there are government officials that they're answerable to, and whether that's the Public Utility Commission of Texas, or the California Public Utility Commission, or FERC in the instance of the U.S. There is a regulator who they report to. So, but at the end of the day, the way that this industry is organized in the States is that the decisions about resource adequacy are not federal decisions. They're not FERC or NERC. They're state decisions. So it is the PUC commissioners, ultimately in California, who are responsible for ensuring that we have the appropriate level of resource adequacy. They're appointed by the governor, so that the governor is responsible, and they're confirmed by the Senate. So it is ultimately the body politic of California that's responsible for ensuring that we have the right set of resources to achieve the resource adequacy that we all desire and think is appropriate. So I do think that the commissioners are the ones that are directly in the crosshair. And I very much think that they're feeling the heat. They understand that they are in this position of having to make the difficult decisions. And I don't think it was an easy vote for any of them to come out with this proposal early in the year to procure 7,500 megawatts of new capacity between now and 2025. That's an awful lot of capacity. It's an awful lot of money that needs to be spent to ensure that our system is going to be reliable. But that is the proposal that's out there based on the best technical information that they could gather in a relatively short time.
Okay, I'm going to come to you, David, to talk about Australia, but I want to bring in Phil now, because I think, Phil, you could answer this, because this is not politically charged. Is that what Arne just said, possibly an overreaction, and therefore it's going to cost the consumer more? Phil?
Well,
it
how do we
seems
know?
It is. Well, I mean, Arne seems to be telling
it
is.
Well, I don't know that, right? I mean, I'll just say this, somewhat humorously. I remember talking with one of our transmission planners a few years ago, and I asked him, how for certain you're going to need the new transmission line. And he said, we'll definitely need that new transmission line. It's just a matter of which year it'll suddenly be required, okay? So I think what Arne's saying here is exactly on point. There's nothing wrong with leaning forward and procuring additional resources that are consistent with your procurement objectives and buying them a little bit early because we are going through a very substantial transition. Arne, you didn't mention it, but for everybody's benefit here, I think we can say that, right now, the ISO's portion of the system is still relying on over 50% of the capacity is natural gas resources. So even though you see us reporting very high levels of renewable energy serving load, in some cases, some hours beyond 70%, the reality of it is the installed capacity is still substantially leaning upon natural gas resources to provide the reliability that we do have on the grid. So actually procuring another 7,000 or 8,000 megawatts a few years, in different views perspective, a few years early, is just simply providing a little bit of the insurance policy that we probably need to make the full transition over the course of the next 20 or 30 years.
Well, just to be clear, Mark, I wasn't trying to imply that that decision was unwise or that it was an overreaction. I think it's probably just about the right, most appropriate reaction that they could, given the numbers that were before them.
Right.
Yeah, but
I agree.
is it not always true that people always err on the side of caution because there's no upside to the other side of the equation? It's asymmetric, isn't it? If you're going to get blamed just as a blackout and you've got control of what to build, you'll build more. But look, let's leave it there. Let's move on a little bit. So, Erik, I want you to have a look at this question, and it's related to two other questions. So it's the one that's up there. It says, Erik, do we have necessary tools and methods to calculate ORA with new generation mix of wind and PV and batteries? And I also want you to try and take a punt at the question by Bill H. I don't know what Bill H is. I'm not sure what the H means, but Bill H has a very good question down there that I think is somewhat related. One of the pundits making the rounds about what happened in Texas is saying, among other things, that complexity is bad. I presume IMHO means, in my opinion, complexity enabled. So, you're into market design, calculations, all the rest of it. So is complexity a problem, and do we have the complex tools to do these calculations?
Yeah, let me try to respond to those. So, the first question, I think that we're starting to develop some of these tools. Some of the different things that I mentioned in my talk, I feel like each of those, potentially requires some enhancements to, the traditional tools that we use for resource adequacy were fairly simple, Monte Carlo simulations, or even, capacity outage probability tables. And I think that now we're seeing that, in many ways we're able to run sort of detailed production cost models over a lot of scenarios, and that kind of helps us understand a little bit better about, and I think that happens a lot in California and a few other places to help understand that, by doing things like incorporating the gas system. You mentioned Alex's talk from before, or being able to actually represent some of these extreme scenarios within the modeling. I think there's still some more work to be done in some of those aspects. And I think that a lot of the folks developing these tools have, sort of know where things are going. It becomes sort of, when are there the trade-offs with, kind of leading into the next question, when are there the trade-offs of complexity and accuracy? Because sometimes it might be that you use one of these complex tools to learn how some of the complexities impact, these types of studies. And then after you learn that, maybe you don't need to use those complex tools anymore because you can learn some rules of thumb that you've, been able to justify, can answer most of the questions. That's not always the case, but maybe in some cases it is. So, I don't know how to, the question about complexity generally, that's hard to say. I think there's obviously some people out there like the comment that they're saying, complexity is bad. We hear that a lot in the market design space, when you start adding all these attributes using different, mathematical methods for pricing. And, and everything else. And, why don't we just have a simple, bid and min-max limit, and that's it. And there's some, there's some complications to that. There's been, I think in most of these cases, there's always pros and cons to each of these features, and folks have to kind of think, through what works the best for their particular situation. So, yeah, I know that's not the best way of answering it, but that seems to be always what we get to.
Yeah, because if you don't put in some of these complexities, you won't get what you really want, and that's inefficient. But if you drive it too far, it might be inefficient as well. So it's a practical. I think it's an engineering question. Engineering is the art of approximation. I think we'll move on now to Terry Oliver has a question here. I presume it's the same Terry Oliver that I know and love. And I think it's related to somewhat to Russ Philbick's questions as well. So I'm going to give both of them, and they're US-centric, I think. Well, sorry, one of them's US-centric. So Terry's question is, should flexible load be made fully operational and included in RA calculations and driven by dollars per FERC 22.2a? That's a FERC order of some description. But another related one is from Russ Philbick, which is more general, I think. Arne, your pessimism is based on assumed inflexibility in load. Why are you not more optimistic about load participation? I've got to take those two to be roughly equivalent to some extent. So I don't know. Arne, Erik, someone from the US, and I'll tell you what, can somebody from the US make an attempt at the FERC 22A part? And if someone from Australia can make an attempt at the, what about, why are you not more? Well, Arne, yeah, I suppose. Arne, it's up to you to do the flexibility one, and then Erik or Phil on the FERC 22A. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start off. I think it's really, really important to get load flexibility into the market, to get loads more directly responding to wholesale market signals so that they can provide flexibility at times when we need it. It would be way cheaper to get flexible loads bidding than it is to build a whole bunch of batteries to provide essentially the same service of energy time shift and arbitrage. So I absolutely think that's really important. It's really challenging because it sits right in the US at the seam of jurisdiction between FERC and the states. So how to get retail regulated loads that are regulated by the states to receive a wholesale price signal without a bunch of cost shifting, and there's a lot of just complexity there. But I absolutely think that that's really fundamentally of importance for the system going forward.
Okay, and Erik or Phil on the 22, or Phil, go on. So.
Yeah, this is Phil. I'll just follow on to what Arne was saying, well, at least in my opening comments, I was trying to make the point that the flexible resources that we see in the future are not only going to be the new generating resources, but also we're going to need to be even more flexible demand as well. We currently have thousands of megawatts of demand response available to us, and we have used that under some of the more stressed operating conditions. And so I totally agree with what FERC's Order 222 is doing, because it's talking about, as Terry is suggesting, why don't we get more flexible load into these markets and make it more available to the system operators? We fully support that. And the CAISO has some of the more advanced demand products available in our wholesale markets. The other thing it mentions is, why isn't it included in the RA calculations? And I can assure you, since California's RA program began, demand has been incorporated into RA calculations. It's always been a resource, and it also counts as an offset against some of the load side of the equation as well. So we are big proponents of seeing flexible load available to us.
Okay, it's 2 minutes past the hour wherever you are in the world, unless you're on a half-hour time zone, which I think there's a few in the world. We're going to have to wrap this up. So look, I want to thank the panel. We can give them a round of applause. I think there's a way of doing clicking an icon, but anyway, so thanks to the panel. I'd like to thank the audience as well, because I think their answers and their questions were great. We didn't get to anywhere near all the questions, and I admit that. Some of the questions I deliberately left out because they're straightforward, sort of yes and no type answers, and we will try and answer them in a follow-up. So time to wrap up. It's the last, it's the last session of ESIG for this time. I think that it really did bring together a lot of the sessions in ESIG. All came, not all of them, but a lot of them did come up here today. And I think that's the interesting thing about this whole area. Everything is now connected to everything else, and nothing can move unless everything moves. The holistic approach is definitely required. And I think that's why ESIG is in the right space. It's about everything being integrated. So there's, we are meeting online for the moment. We don't know when that's going to end. Maybe next year, maybe next spring, we'll see. But the next event for ESIG is on April 20th, when Jay Caspery of Grid Strategies and Bruce Teshida of Brattle are going to give a Grid Enhancing Technologies webinar. No charge for it as usual. So I hope to see you there on April 20th, and wish you all a good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and thank you very much. We are done. And yes, it was Terry Oliver that I know. Hi, Terry. Okay, bye.